There has been a lot of discussion recently on the new education policy. The discussion began shortly after the draft, an early draft of the new education policy was circulated. In what follows, I'm not going to talk about the document itself, but I would like to talk about the future or the likely futures of higher education in particular. And I would like to talk about it with reference to some of the suggestions and policy claims made in this document. My starting point would be the strongest claim, which is often made, that one of its goals is the decolonization of education itself and of higher education in particular. And I would start out by saying that, it depends what one means by decolonization. And I think there are at least three components to decolonization. The first of which, of course, relates to the democratization of higher education. And the second and the third are related to each other, and these are issues of what I would call issues of connectivity, and the third meaning issues of plurality and diversity. And I don't think that one can look at the future of higher education without keeping these three concerns in mind, these three concerns of decolonization in mind. And I say this as a student of higher education in India, particularly from the end of the 19th century into our own times. If you look at the long history of the university, then what we learned in the 19th century, that in a way the university was contributing to the task of nation building. And I think it performed this task not just in India, but it performed this task in many parts of the world, in most parts of the world where a university system was established. But I think towards the last decades of the 20th century, the university was not just contributing to nation building, the university went international, all right? In other words, there was a mobility of students, of professionals trained within national universities who migrated to other places to seek employment there. So the university was also preparing an international cadre of highly trained professionals who were mobile. Today, I would like to touch upon this less discussed task of the university, because I think we have recognized, in the light of the pandemic that has been raging over the last year and a half, as well as major climate changes that have been taking place, that we also have to think about planetary futures. And that when we plan for our education, we are not just planning for the task of nation building, but we are planning for the task of a deeply, highly connected world. Are we thinking along this line, along these lines, in these possibilities when we think of higher education and the decolonization of higher education? Are we thinking about these connectivities? Are we thinking about planetary futures? These are some of the issues I think we need to think about in reimagining the future of the university. The issue of democracy, the issue of connectivity, and the issue of plurality and diversity. And of course, very often this plurality and diversity in some quarters is taken to mean divisiveness rather than contributing both to the enrichment of culture and the enrichment of perspectives and different points of view. One can make an argument from this from the philosophies of science, but that is not something I would go into on this occasion. That's something to be discussed at another moment. So why do I say that? Well, I mean, or how does one think higher education contributes to decolonization? And I think this is not a new agenda of higher education. It goes back to the last decades of the 19th century, and one definition of decolonization is disidentification with colonial practices. And the university system that was first established in India, the modern university system, in 1857 is what educationists refer to as the university as an examining body. And from the 1870s onwards, beginning with the Indian Association of, the IACS, the Indian Association for the Cultivation of Sciences, there was a long struggle which went on amongst those who were getting educated. The university we want is a university of teaching and research. And the University of Teaching and Research itself, the struggle to establish a university of teaching and research, was the first moment of decolonization. And today, we don't seem to realize that over a century, what we have developed in India is a very complex ecology, highly differentiated, with a multiplicity of functions, all right, at different levels. Because as a society becomes more complex, as production functions differentiate, the system of knowledge production also differentiates to a great degree. Today, we like to refer to ourselves as a knowledge society. If we are indeed a knowledge society, then, are we going to basically separate the teaching functions from research functions? Or are we going to say, we wish to further develop and elaborate upon this structure we have taken a long time to develop, rather than say, well, we should have colleges for teaching and we should have separate research institutes. We don't seem to understand the logic of what was referred to as the unity of teaching and research. All right? Now, I think that this thinking has also been, in a way, I don't want to use this catch-all term neoliberalism, but this thinking has also been kind of driven by certain assumptions of neoliberalism. And the assumptions behind the neoliberal argument for separating the teaching function from the research function of a university has been that, universities have become very big. A small percentage of students who go through the university basically end up in research positions. Most of them go on to perform other functions within society. And the second assumption is that, in the University of Teaching and Research, no matter what you do, you're trained to be a researcher. And that doesn't dovetail with the requirements of society. That by itself cannot become the logic for separating the ideal that drives the University of Teaching and Research. And I think this University of Teaching and Research is under threat. And although the government has constantly said that funding for research will not come down, we have seen, India used to be a kind of model for third world countries. I remember in the late 1990s meeting researchers from other parts of the third world who said, the amount of money your government invests in research is really very interesting. And what did we invest? Close to 1% of our GDP, which was anywhere near the 4% of the GDP of the American economy or the Korean economy or any of these economies. But it was still a kind of, symbol for the third world, that India has built a tremendous scientific and research establishment on which the skills of this society develop. There's much criticism of the policies of the 1950s. And if you ask me really, I think that the policies of the 1950s to invest in higher education and to invest in the development of a scientific and technological system, however suboptimal it was, I think we should have invested more, began to pay dividends rather slightly late, in the sense it's a question of delayed impact. When people criticize the policies of the 1950s and the 1960s, they don't realize that these policies began to pay off in the 1980s and the 1990s. All right? If India has joined the information economy in a way, in such a significant way, it's also a result of those policies of the 1950s and 60s that paid off a decade, 2 or 3 decades later. So, I think that we have to learn to look at the research system as a highly differentiated system, all right? It is an ecological system full of connections. I don't wish to criticize the vocationalization of education, which is part of the policy, one of the instruments of the new education policy. I don't wish to criticize that, but I do not think you can promote the vocationalization of education at the cost of either dismantling or underemphasizing the importance of the scientific and technological research system. Because all these elements are deeply connected. You make a small change in one, you can end up destroying something else. You can end up, undermining another component of this system. All right? And so one has to look at the kind of linkages which are established from higher secondary education to undergraduate education to then postgraduate education and research. Now this needs to be thought about rather carefully. We can't take unilateral policies that this is the way this will be done, and this will be done at the cost of a certain kind of indigenism. All right? So that's one part of my argument. The second part of my argument has to do with the fact that even if we look at this system of higher education and research, this system is defined by a certain dualism. There are the institutions of national importance where indeed advanced research is done and where researchers are connected with the frontiers with their colleagues at the frontiers of science in different parts of the world. You have the central universities and you have funded state universities. And the difference in levels of research between these three is indeed quite substantial. And I think the task of the national educational policy should have been, rather than say, well, there are places for research and there are places for teaching, should we say, how do we build even the research capacities at state level universities so that they can become responsive to state level needs? What does educational reform therefore mean of the higher education system? The policy talks about processes of mentoring. Yeah, but have we learnt anything from the processes of mentoring? We have tried to establish the different experiments that have gone on in the country, which were developed at the Indian Academy of Sciences and other places, and put in place and said, rather, let us now multiply these experiments at the different institutes already available to us so that we can bridge this gap between these three tiers, the underfed, understaffed state level universities, the less funded central universities, and the well-funded universities of research and teaching. This is not an either-or proposition, because the well-funded institutes of research have felt very often that the quality of students sometimes coming in from the central universities or the state universities into the institutions of national importance has been declining. It has been declining, but it has been declining why? All right. Now, they have tried to put measures in place to rectify some of these, but a lot more has to be done. Now, one can take two attitudes: to build new structures, or on the other hand, to reform slowly and improvise and fund already existing structures. How is this to be done? It's not a question of, how you look at research institutions or how you look at higher education. Institutions of higher education take a long period of nursing. They have long gestation periods. To build a good tradition of research and teaching takes a long time. You can't build them overnight. So I think we've not looked back and said, well, which were our successes and what can we look back, what can we learn from those successes, and what were our failures and what can we learn from them, and then try to reinvigorate our state level institutions and those central universities which have gone into decline. The other important and related issue I would like to bring up here is a very important political philosopher has told us that social justice is not possible without cognitive justice. And I would also say cognitive justice is not possible without social justice. Now, why do I bring up this point? I bring up this point because all those who are now talking about the privatization of higher education in India basically acquired their own education at public institutions. All right? And now you wish to abandon these public institutions and replace them with or substitute them with private institutions, which may well be beyond the resources of the majority of the population. Can we achieve social justice like this? So, I mean, in order to acquire social justice, we have to deliver on cognitive justice. And that role could have been performed, was performed to an extent in our public institutions, but the new education policy doesn't seem to seem... It wants cognitive justice, but it wants cognitive justice perhaps at the cost of social justice. So we have to basically re-look at the strategies of privatization or the lack of support for public institutions. Can we undermine the systems of public institutions? We all know that our parents, all who studied and who emphasized the importance of higher education for us, most of them studied in government schools. What is the status of government schools today? All right. In like manner, I would like to ask that most of us acquired our education in public funded institutions. Are we going to undermine these public funded institutions? Are we going to undermine public institutions and replace them with private institutions? I raise this issue because I believe that we cannot create a just knowledge society unless higher education is widespread. We cannot speak of a knowledge society. We cannot speak of a just knowledge society without, in a way, contributing towards the enrichment of the system of higher education. All right? So, if I go back then and talk about decolonization, I don't think the decolonization of higher education can mean just the indigenization of higher education. Because the system of higher education today is globally a deeply connected one. When you look at some of the debates on decolonization in South Africa, it is an opening out into the world. It is about connectivities. We have to consider planetary futures. All right? And we are also creating a manpower which is going to be mobile. So how do we simultaneously manage the task of nation building, but also produce a cadre of highly trained professionals who can ensure the existence of who can ensure a sustainable future? So we are not just planning for the nation. We are planning for sustainable futures, for a planetary future. All right? And so we have to think then in terms of a cosmopolitics of education. These are tasks we need to think about deeply when we think of higher education. And of course, the national education policy, while talking of diversity, has not probably paid enough attention to these aspects of higher education. I'd like to conclude then by also stressing this important point about diversity. All right? And in talking about diversity, the differentiation of the system of higher education also in a way reflects an attempt to engage with the diversity of Indian cultures, and of course also to engage with the place of India in a globalized world. All right? So we are thinking of a nation which is culturally diverse, but we are also thinking of a world which is culturally diverse. Right? And when we think about this world which is culturally diverse, then we also have to think about how do we sustain such a world which is culturally diverse and which is marred by conflict. Education must provide us the means of thinking through these conflicts. All right? To think about a planetary future, to think about sustainable future. The national education policy should give us some indication as to how are we going to deal with a planetary future. How do we negotiate the task between building such a diverse nation on the one hand and simultaneously contributing towards producing a cadre of trained professionals who can work with people across different national contexts in building a sustainable future.